Hello and welcome, soldiers. It's your boy Salt and Skinny, general of all that's lean and politically unclean. It is the turn of the 18th century, and after over 1,000 years since Muhammad's revelation, Islamic civilization remains to be the dominant political force of the globe. Even with the rise of European colonialism and the Qing dynasty of China, the early 1700s still revolved around Muslim empires. During this time, the Mughal Empire of India was the largest economy in the world, accounting for up to 25% of the world's GDP, equivalent to what the economic share of the United States is today. Both the Ottoman and Mughal empires were among the first to establish modern standing armies, with their troop counts being one of, if not the largest in the world. The influence, glamour, and sophistication that these empires radiated was well known among their contemporaries, as global trade and travel revolved around their territories. In the future, we know that these imperial powers will eventually be overshadowed by Western empires, but in the early 1700s, the crown of the Mughal and Ottoman Badishah was the most prestigious position in the world. In between these two massive Sunni empires were the Shiite Safavids, an imperial dynasty that constantly found itself fighting its larger neighbors. Although powerful and influential in its own right, the Safavids were always the lesser of the three gunpowder empires. For one, it wasn't really much of a gunpowder empire to begin with. Its military mostly consisted of troops armed with arrows, lances, and swords, with firearms being restricted to only a small subsection of the army. Its diverse population and mountainous terrain made it difficult for the government to maintain unity and stability. On top of that, the Safavid kings were only getting lazier by each generation, spending their time partying more so than administrating. The weakness of the kings ultimately led to the collapse of the state, and by 1722, the Safavid Empire fell to the militant Hotaki Afghans. From the disorder, the Ottoman, Russian, and Mughal empires were only being strengthened, and the authority of the Safavid king was only growing weaker. But in the midst of all of this chaos and weak leadership, a man would rise to bring order and strength back to Iran. His presence would be one of fear and fascination, as he against all odds managed to achieve the impossible. For this man is not only one of Iran's most legendary figures, but also one of the main reasons for why the age of Islamic dominance came to a turbulent end. Born in the steppes of Khorasan, close to what is now the city of Dargaz, Iran, Tahmasp Nadir Koli was brought up by a humble peasant family that lived a pastoral and nomadic life. His kin were members of the Turkish Afshar tribe, who had for years served as members of the Kizilbash Confederacy, the loyal soldiers of the Safavid dynasty. Life as a shepherd wasn't easy for the young Nadir, whose father died when he was just about 13 years old. Without the protection of a man, Nadir and his mother were vulnerable to Uzbek raiders, who captured the two as slaves. While his mother died in captivity, Nadir managed to escape back to his home in Khorasan. Desperate for survival, Nadir turned to a life of crime, stealing livestock with a group of friends in exchange for money and food. But being a petty thief could only sustain Nadir for so long, and the young man was beginning to show signs of greater ambitions. He advertised himself to a local beg who took him in as one of his personal messengers to the Shah. Although accompanied by another courier, Nadir was the only one out of the two who arrived at Sultan Hussein's court. It is suspected that Nadir killed the second courier, but the reasons for why are not quite clear. Whatever the motive, Nadir was able to convince the Shah to pardon him, and he was able to return back to his employer. The Beg, however, was not pleased that Nadir just murdered one of his messengers. Assuming that the Beg was plotting revenge, Nadir killed him before he even got the chance, running away to the mountains of Mazandaran. In exile, Nadir would have his first son with the Beg's daughter and form a gang of bandits with his new friends and followers. While his crew of bandits raided the villages of Mazandaran, Nadir moved back to Khorasan, enlisting himself in the governor's military as a musket man. The young recruit would have the chance to prove himself when he led the Khan's army to fight off a large band of Tartar raiders. Having been a raider himself, Nadir had far more fighting experience than his fellow soldiers, quickly taking command of the army and leading them into victory. Returning to the Khan victorious, Nadir got a little cocky about his credentials and demanded that he be made general of the army. The Khan rejected Nadir's application and instead appointed one of his relatives as the new general. Seeing that the position he so rightfully deserved was being given to someone else simply because of their lineage, Nadir called out the Khan for having no honor, which was something you just didn't say to a man back then. The Khan punished Nadir by whipping him on the soles of his feet. Humiliated, Nadir would return to a life of crime, raiding the same villages he once protected under the Khan. In 1722, the Afghan Hotaks led by Mohammad Hotaki overran the crumbling Safavid Empire, forcing Sultan Hussein to give up his throne in Isfahan. Despite its overthrow, the Safavid crown still had loyal supporters, rallying behind Sultan Hussein's son and heir Shah Tahmasp II. In need of an army, Tahmasp asked the Kizilbesh for their help, and among the clans summoned were the Afshars. Arriving in Khorasan with a loyalist army, the Shah asked Nadir and his gang to join his coalition. Seeing an opportunity to finally become a general, Nadir agreed to join the army. However, Tahmasp already had a renowned general by the name of Fateh Ali Khan commanding his army. Fateh Ali was a member of the Turkic Qajar tribe from what is now modern-day Azerbaijan, and because of his tribe's connections and loyalty to the Safavids, he was granted authority over the Shah's new coalition. However, Nadir wasn't interested in taking orders. He wanted to become a general, but if he was going to achieve that, he first needed to impress the Shah on the battlefield. Knowing that it was too early to take the capital of Isfahan, Nadir and the Safavid armies focused their attention in capturing the cities of Khorasan. Tahmasp was an inexperienced commander, and Fateh Ali's loyalty to the Safavids was always under question, so Nadir took the liberty of leading the army. Under Nadir's leadership, the loyalists were able to take much of Khorasan's cities, giving the Safavids a base of operations to conduct other attacks on the Hotaks. Finding newfound respect among the soldiers and Shah Tahmasp, Nadir was becoming a prominent member of the royal army and court. With his new influence, Nadir persuaded Tahmasp into getting rid of Fateh Ali, whose relationship with the king only grew more tense each day. In October of 1726, Nadir ordered the execution of Fateh Ali, with Tahmasp subsequently granting him both the position of general and the title of Khan. Nadir continued to campaign in the name of restoring the Shah's throne, leading the army into victory in Herat and consolidating much of eastern Iran and Afghanistan. The Hotaks consistently outnumbered the loyalists in battle, and despite initial success due to superior tactics, Nadir knew he needed to reform the army. Since the Afghan and Iranian armies mostly relied on cavalry, Nadir decided to focus his attention into developing a modernized infantry, utilizing firearms and artillery as the main mode of assault. The gun of choice was a flintlock musket called the Jazair. The Jazair's long barrel and heavy caliber not only made it more deadly than the average European musket, but it also made it more accurate at a much longer range. As well as an array of heavy and light cannons, Nadir's army also utilized a unique piece of artillery known as the Zamburak, a swivel gun mounted to the back of a camel. Due to the mountainous terrain of the Iranian plateau, carrying heavy artillery was always far more dangerous for armies than it was beneficial. But Being on a camel's back, the Zamburak is easy to transport and utilize, since it's always on the move and only needs one person to operate. Along with modern weapons, Nadir also had a strong emphasis on discipline and merit, consistently paying his army on time and allowing high-performing soldiers the opportunity to climb up the ranks. Being a nomad from the Asian steppes, Nadir idolized the generalship of figures like Genghis Khan and Tamerlane, not only adopting their tactics, but also their brutality, as terrorizing his army and subjects was how he often maintained their loyalty. With this combination of modern weapons, tactics, and terror, Nadir and his forces would humiliate the much larger Hotak armies, pitting their swords and arrows against modern artillery and muskets. In 1729, Nadir recaptured the city of Isfahan and restored the Safavid throne with Tahmasp as Shah. With the Hotaks mostly taken care of, Nadir looked westward towards the Ottomans, who had in 1724 partitioned the eastern half of Iran's territory with Russia. In 1730, Nadir would face off against the much larger Ottoman forces, who, unlike the Hotaks, were a modernized military, with heavy artillery and a professional infantry. But in spite of the odds, Nadir would rapidly crush the Ottoman forces and recapture most of Iran's eastern provinces within the span of just 6 months. Nadir's string of lightning-fast and impressive victories intimidated everybody around him, including the Shah. You see, even though Nadir's campaigns expanded the authority of the restored Safavid Empire, Tahmasp was becoming increasingly jealous of his general's accomplishments. To prove a point, Tahmasp encouraged Nadir to retire, while he personally led an army to capture the Ottoman-held city of Yerevan. This proved to be a disastrous idea, as Tahmasp not only failed to capture the city, but he also ended up losing all of the territory Nadir had gained the year prior, which, if you could imagine, infuriated Nadir. In 1732, after his humiliating return, Nadir invited the Shah for a dinner at his quarters. During the dinner, Nadir encouraged the Shah to continue drinking until the point of intoxication. He then brought the inebriated king in front of the courtiers, asking them if they thought a man like this was fit enough to be a king. The courtiers agreed to renounce the Shah of his crown in favor of his 6-month-old son Abbas III. Nadir would be the baby king's regent, which essentially made him the Shah of the empire in every respect other than by name. But Nadir had no time to fuss over titles, as he now had to regain all of the territory Tahmasp had lost. Nadir decided that the best course of action was to take Baghdad, in which, if successful, he would exchange for the lost territory. However, this maneuver did not go as planned, as the Ottoman army led by Topul Osman Pasha managed to defend the city from Nadir's advances in what would be the first and only time Nadir ever lost a battle. Sour from his loss and headstrong in his pursuit, Nadir would again invade Mesopotamia, this time defeating and killing Osman Pasha in battle. His victory would gain him control of the Mesopotamian basin, and by 1735 he had reached the Caucasus region, seizing the cities of Ganja, Tbilisi, and Yerevan. In response, the Ottomans deployed a massive army to meet Nadir's forces in what is now Yerevan, Armenia. There, the over 80,000 strong Ottoman army faced off against Nadir's humble force of just 15,000. On the same day they arrived, the Ottoman forces ended up retreating with only about 8,000 of their soldiers returning. The miraculous victory at Yerevan not only resulted in the Ottoman surrender, but it also greatly impressed the Russian Empire, who in the same year gifted all of the territory it gained from the Persian partition in exchange for an alliance with Nadir. The following year, the Russians would soon have the confidence to attack Ottoman positions in Ukraine and begin the Russo-Turkish War. Returning from his second victorious campaign against the Ottomans, Nadir decided that it was finally time to secure his position as the true Shah of Iran. After all, he had already single-handedly restored the Safavid throne, humiliated its adversaries, and regained all of its former territory. If anyone was to be Shah based on merit, it should rightfully be Nadir. With a group of his commanders and members of the royal court, Nadir would host a kurultai regarding his merit for becoming king. The members of the meeting agreed, and on March 8, 1736, Nadir would be crowned the Shah-an-Shah, of Iran. As Shah, Nadir would govern his empire as he commanded his army. He violently quashed any revolts and rebellions that objected to his rule, terrorizing his people in the process. The empire that Nadir inherited had no funds to its name, and was only able to function as a state due to the army's strength. If Nadir was to maintain control of the empire and its subjects, he was going to need some money to keep the people happy and his army growing. So in 1738, Nadir's imperial army marched east towards the Mughal Empire, the wealthiest nation in the 18th century world. Prior to Nadir's invasion, the Mughals were already facing internal divisions in its domain, with the mighty Hindu Maratha Empire proving to be a major competitor for the Indian subcontinent. But even with this massive thorn at its side, the Mughals remained the richest empire in the world, and had a massive military under its command. But the power of the Mughals didn't faze Nadir, whose armies were already making short work of the empire's vassals in Afghanistan. Nadir would take his army through the Khyber Pass in what is now Pakistan, defeating the Mughal vassal of Peshawar and taking their governor as a prisoner of war. Hearing news of the Persian victory at Peshawar, the Mughal emperor Muhammad Shah rallied an army of about 300,000 men from all over the empire. The Mughals had muskets, heavy artillery, and hundreds of war elephants, ready to meet Nadir's army of just over 50,000 in what is now Karnal, India. But even with all its glorious weaponry and overwhelming numbers, the mighty Mughal military couldn't last 3 hours against Nadir's smaller but more professional army. Victorious, Nadir would enter the Mughal capital of Delhi, with the Emperor Muhammad Shah as his new vassal. However, the citizens revolted against the Iranian occupation, prompting Nadir and his army to sack the city and massacre thousands of its inhabitants. Nadir and his men would loot the riches of the city, seizing the imperial treasury that consisted of precious metals and gems worth billions of dollars. Among the treasures stolen were some of the world's largest diamond cuts, and the jewel-decorated peacock throne that now seated Nadir as the world's richest ruling king. The wealth robbed from Delhi was so abundant that Nadir ceased all taxation in the empire for a period of 3 years, allowing him to finance his campaigns and expand his army. After plundering India, Nadir headed for the Asian steppes, conquering the khanates of cities like Bukhara and Khiva. As he continued to grow the empire's territory abroad, Nadir left his eldest son Reza in charge of domestic affairs. While Reza was maintaining peace and stability in the empire, Nadir was becoming increasingly unstable himself, as his mental health began to deteriorate. In 1741, while en route to quash a revolt in Dagestan, Nadir experienced an assassination attempt that left him wounded. Paranoid and short-tempered, Nadir accused his son of plotting the assassination, blinding him in response. The blinding of his oldest son cut a deep emotional wound with Nadir, as he very quickly regretted the action. To make himself feel better, he ordered the execution of all the nobles that witnessed the blinding of his son, and began a new campaign in the Persian Gulf. By 1743, Nadir conquered all of the lands surrounding the Gulf, and expanded his imperial navy to include fleets of Iranian, British, Dutch, and Russian ships. At this time, Nadir's army had grown to over 300,000 strong, making him in command of the most powerful army in the world. With this insane amount of power and wealth, Nadir had insane ambitions, envisioning an empire that stretched from the Indus rivers to the east and the Bosphorus Strait to the west. To achieve this, Nadir initiated a third campaign against the Ottomans, seizing the Iraqi cities of Kirkuk and Ardabil. During his siege of Mosul, Nadir and his forces were forced to withdraw due to rebellions in the Caucasus. After brutally crushing these persistent revolts, Nadir turned back towards the Ottomans to the city of Kars, where he would once again humiliate their armies. But despite Nadir's consistent victories against his enemies, it was clear that the king wasn't the military genius he once was. His mental health was only getting worse, making him far more unhinged and irrational than usual. Although still victorious against the Ottomans, Nadir decided to cut his campaign short in 1746, leaving the territories between the two powers as they were prior to the war. Nadir's empire was constantly experiencing rebellions, which distracted him from his campaign, making the king more despotic and cruel with each and every day. While quashing a Kurdish rebellion in Khorasan, some of Nadir's officers feared that the Shah's mental instability could lead to their execution. So in the middle of the night, while the king slept, 15 conspirators entered his tent to assassinate him. But being the legend that he was, Nadir actually managed to wake up and kill 2 of the conspirators, right before the rest of the 13 brutally murdered him. After his death, Nadir's nephew would inherit the title of Shah, but turmoil within the royal family led to the complete disintegration of the empire, with nearly all of the provinces declaring independence by 1748. Nadir's entire life's work was lost in the course of a year. At the height of his reign, Nadir was the richest and most powerful monarch in the world, ruling the largest Iranian empire since the Sassanians. But as a consequence of his poor governance, Iran would experience internal strife for decades to come, and the result of his brilliant campaigns would mark the end of Islamic world dominance. The Mughal Empire, once the wealthiest nation on earth, had its capital city sacked and looted, being left completely vulnerable to outside forces. According to British writer Michael Axworthy, the East India Company's influence and eventual rule of India would have occurred much later, if not at all, without Nadir's seizure of Delhi. The Ottoman Empire, that once boasted one of the largest and most powerful militaries in the world, was utterly humiliated by Nadir's much smaller army on not 1, not 2, but 3 separate campaigns. These consistent grand losses inflicted by Nadir's invasions decimated much of the empire's armed forces and inspired many European powers like Russia and Austria to go on the offensive. The Ottomans would remain to be a powerful force throughout the later half of the 18th century, but after Nadir's campaigns, it was clear that its place on the world stage was only decreasing. The golden age of Islamic world dominance was finally coming to a close. Western Europe and its intercontinental empires were now the new superpowers, having the largest armies and economies of their day. In the West, Nadir's military victories were the stuff of a legend, with kings, generals, and scholars calling him the new Alexander. The famous French general turned emperor Napoleon Bonaparte was a great admirer of Nadir Shah, having read his biography as a young student. But of course, in a Eurocentric world, Nadir Shah is often referred to as the Persian Napoleon, with his story and accomplishments often being overshadowed by the tales of European generals and kings. Europe was now the center of global power and prestige. And with that, the stories of non-European figures and places suddenly became less relevant, which is why we don't often hear much about Nadir Shah, and if we're being honest, Islamic history in general. But regardless of how little attention is given to him, it doesn't change the fact that Nadir Shah is an absolute legend. The guy went from being a simple peasant flocking sheep to commanding the largest and most professional military of his day. He single-handedly built his army and empire from the ground up, becoming the wealthiest and most powerful man in the world. Yeah, he was a brute and completely insane, but his life was one of insanity. He lived in a kill or be killed world. Nothing was ever handed to this guy. Everything that he accomplished came from his own ambition and merit. Nadir was a self-made king. Whether or not people remember his story or even his name doesn't change the massive footprint this man left in world history. And when talking about the Middle East, it is often the most forgotten people and places that make the most memorable of impacts. Next episode, we return to the forgotten cradle of civilization, exploring the world of Arabia's neglected empires. We will travel the deserts and seas that make this land one of the most diverse and contentious places on Earth, giving you all a reminder for why you should always #RememberYemen.